Okay.
Howdy all. Welcome to this is our third, right, Mark? I haven't lost count.
Third.
I'm no
Yep.
math major,
Yep.
but I think it's third podcast and our third Zoom conversation. Mark and I started these as a brainstorm a little while ago. Finally had an opportunity to start doing them just with the beginning of the coronavirus. And the podcast will eventually be called, you can look for it under the title of Unlikely Pilgrims. And what we're hoping to do with these is to really talk about how Christians are trying to somehow hold together their ancient faith with contemporary problems and contemporary crises and issues. We, the church, come from all over the world. We're going to talk about that a bit today with Dr. Zimmerman. And that comes with a lot of challenges. How do we hold an ancient faith in a modern world with modern technology and coronaviruses, or even from first world, modern industrialized, post-industrialized societies like here with countries that are behind, but yet their faith and their churches are robust and their witness to the world is powerful. So what we're going to do in this and others is really sort of focus in on that relationship, that what we're calling negotiation. How do we as Christians negotiate? And we want to be clear what we mean by that is we're not saying that we're looking for ways to compromise our faith. We're saying, how do we hold and not change our faith while we're facing changing situations? So the American church has, I think, been faithful over its history. It's got certainly some critical pieces to it and made some errors, but it's facing a new challenge now, globalization, global issues, global concerns, as well as something like the coronavirus. So how do we, and what we're talking through is how do we have our ancient faith be living in these moments and not be taken over by cultural concerns or taken over by our own narrow background. So that's what we're trying to do here. I don't know if, Mark, you want to add anything else to the intro before we...
No, I think that's good. I think this sort of segment, we're kind of sort of seeking God in the whirlwind. And right now we're looking at this whirlwind of pandemic and trying to hear from various voices throughout the church. And just to give you an example, I think with Dr. Farnham's interview the last time, just the influence of medical technology is causing us to have to negotiate some of these things differently than our grandparents would have had to have negotiated them. So I think, it's exactly what we're trying to get at.
Okay, good. And today it is a profound privilege to have Dr. Esther Zimmerman with us. And she has been teaching here for a number of years. I had to ask her because I feel like she's been here as long as I've been here. But she's been teaching here for at least 5 years. And I think she's been interacting. And I want to say you were interacting with Rick Rhodes in our department probably long before that. Is that true, Esther?
I was an adjunct for a couple of years before that.
Yeah, okay.
Been engaged with BC or with LBC probably for 7-8 years altogether.
Okay. And those of you who are not on campus would not know the impact that she's had, but I felt it from faculty and students and administration across campus. She's very, very wise, has experience. Her faith is deep and rich. She has worked as the director of family and ministry and the director of women in ministry leadership programs in the church and ministry leadership department. I can't believe I said all of that without goofing it entirely. And as well as teaching grad classes. And she also works with the Lausanne Movement's children's ministry wing, which is called the Global Children's Forum. So she is often traveling around the world and talking about children's ministry. And Esther, maybe we can just jump in by just asking you that question. You've traveled more, you've seen, you came back just before the coronavirus sort of became this global pandemic. But you have a broader reach maybe at what the church is dealing with globally and how the church is functioning in this time. Is there anything you can give us an overall view of how the church is dealing with this?
Sure. God's given me the privilege of engaging fairly widely with the global church through my ministry before I came to LBC as Children's Ministry Director for a mission organization, and still in an ongoing way through my work with Global Children's Forum. So just before the shutdown happened, I was actually traveling for most of the month. So I was in the UK speaking at 2 women's conferences in February, and then almost immediately left for South Africa, where I was with a group of global leaders for a week. So it's been interesting to have had some of those ongoing conversations concerning the development of the virus with global leaders, but also seeing, I think having traveled in that month prior, seeing the curve of the virus coming our direction before it actually got here.
Maybe just as a way to get into this, because you've seen from the West to the East, and you've seen how the Western Church has been dealing with this, and you've had some experience now with the Eastern Church, or the Southern Church, we should say. What about the way you see the Western Church dealing with some of this, maybe publicly or in your relationships? Is part of the church really confusing sometimes its view of Western life, Western health, Western values, and what we think is probably ultimately Christian values? Like, are we as the West sometimes confusing these things, our expectations for God's work, or how the church should succeed? Anything like that you could help us with?
Yeah, and I certainly don't speak as an expert for the Global South Church, but as I listen to my friends, particularly in the Global South, I think one of the areas where they've challenged me deeply is our expectations of God. I think in the Western world, generally, we've come to a place where we expect to be able to fix the world's problems. And in many ways, we've done that really well. We've done that effectively. Francis Schaeffer talks about the primary goal of life in the West has become personal peace and affluence. Like if my personal life is peaceful and I have what I need, I have things to enjoy, that really my world is set. And a lot of our energies, I think in the West, have been devoted towards creating that sense of personal peace and affluence for ourselves. I think as I interact with global friends, they're living, many of them, in a very different reality where there's not a great deal of personal peace, there's not a great deal of affluence. And I think perhaps one of the biggest differences is their expectation that is something that God owes them. I think at times in the West, perhaps we've come to assume that God's desire for me is personal peace and affluence. And that's not something that I hear primarily from my friends in the Global South.
That's interesting, and that resonates when you say things like that, because I can see the anxieties in my own church, as it almost feels like God has left us when the possibility of personal peace and affluence in a time like this becomes harder to imagine. It's interesting to watch our own faith sort of shake. I think I can feel it in myself, if I'm being honest. How does your experience in those churches bring wisdom back into our position? How do help us recalibrate, if you will?
I think some of my friends push me to a place of reading scripture differently. So when I think about some of the last words of Jesus, like, Jesus was exceptionally clear with his followers that life wasn't going to be easy. In fact, some of his last words were, "In this world, you're going to have trouble. But take heart, I've overcome the world." And the hope that he was leaving them with wasn't that the world was ultimately going to be this amazing place. The hope he was leaving them with was that ultimately, I've got this, and I'm going to be with you in the midst of the trouble. And I think that's a perspective that's easier for some of my friends from the global South to hang on to, because the trouble in their world is very real and very present. I think for us, we've managed to hold a lot of trouble at arm's length. We have created a lot of security for ourselves. We've created secure government systems. We've created secure banking systems. We've created healthcare systems that usually work and are able to fix amazing numbers of things. And our expectation is that potential is limitless, that the government will be 100% stable, that our banks will be 100% reliable, that the healthcare system will 100% come through all the time. And yeah, I'm not sure that's a biblical understanding of our position in the world and what our expectations of God and our world can be.
I was curious, Esther. I was having a Zoom conversation with a good friend of mine who pastors a church, and there's a family in his church. They are from China, and they were in China during the SARS epidemic. And what's actually been comforting to the other members of the church is the way with which this family has engaged this, not in a sort of cavalier way, but there's a sense of been there, done that. Like, we know the routine, we know the process. And even in our offline conversations, you talked a little bit about some ways people in the global South had experienced various things that actually have prepared them. Can you speak a little to that? Some of the realities we can talk about. What are some of the actual realities that people in the global South and so forth are living with that you would take something like this more in stride than if you come from what we were describing, the American mindset?
Sure. Yeah, so one of my closest friends is Sri Lankan, and she and I were chatting last week, and that was her comment, because I said, well, how are your family doing right now? Like, what's life look like in Colombo? And she says, well, the shops are shut. There's a curfew. We're pretty restricted in our movements. But then she kind of laughed and she says, but that's nothing new. We've been there, done that.
Yeah. Yeah.
This time last year, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Easter bombings that took place in churches across Sri Lanka. And the country was on lockdown for at least a month following those attacks. So she's like, this time last year, we were on lockdown as well. So I think there is a sense of expectation that life is going to have challenges. Therefore, it's less surprising when those challenges come. I think for again, because our systems tend to work well, because our country tends to be stable, it's very jarring when our systems cease to work the way we're used to them working.
Dan, you had mentioned this. You had said that even this situation has jarred your faith a bit, and I think all of us would have to say that. But one of the things we were talking about offline with Esther is this idea of God is always at work. And I think it's hard for those of us that almost take the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as almost inerrant, they written by God. And then all of a sudden I'm not happy. And so how do these two things play together? Can you speak a little bit to how some of your friends from the global South will say, I still see God working, even though there's civil war, even though I walk around with a low-grade fever all the time, so forth and so on. Because that's something that our theological ancestors, the Puritans, would have completely understood in 17th century England, but we don't, at least in the last 100 years. So it would be helpful, I think, for our listeners just to hear that process.
It's such an interesting perspective, because I think if our expectations of God are that God is going to give me personal peace and affluence, if my personal peace and my affluence go away, my assumption is that God has also gone away. And when my expectations of God are different, I think it's a little bit easier to see God in the midst of the challenging seasons that we find ourselves in. So this time last month, I was in South Africa with a number of children's ministry leaders from around the world. And one of them was a young man who lives and ministers in South Sudan. And I don't know how much you know about the history of South Sudan. It's one of the newer countries in our world. It's also one of the least peaceful and least stable countries. And I was just asking him generally, sort of, how is life in your country right now? And he sighed and shared some of the horrific reality they're living in. They're living with groups of militia. They're living with massacres. They're living with refugees. They're living with villages being emptied. They're living with people having nothing to eat because the crops haven't been planted. It's dire. And yet, after sharing all of that and also sharing the obvious pain that brought, he went on to say, but God's at work. And went on then to share how God was using the uncertainty, how he was using the displacement of people, how God was very present and active in the midst of what was happening. And I in that moment, I wondered how easily I would be able to see God's hand if it were my family and my village and my future that was at stake.
And that's very powerful, Esther, because I think what you seem to be driving at for me is the fact that our theology has a certain perspective, that we call God successful or loving when there are certain results. And I think you're right in a sense that's nowhere in Scripture, but we certainly have created a way of life that reflects that, or that, that at least trumpets that. So help us, if I can't see what God is doing because he's not improving my life, what is God doing?
Yeah. What are some specifics? Yeah. I want to make a list. Yeah, yeah.
One of the chapters in the Bible I've sat with over the last couple of months has been Psalm 107. Dr. Tague preached on it back at Thanksgiving last year in chapel, and it caught my attention. But it starts with the declaration that give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his love endures forever. And it's the statement of irrefutable fact. And then he goes on to say, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. And he walks through these different stories of hardship, and he comes to the end and he says, let the one who is wise see these things and perceive them. And it's as if the message of the psalm is like, where is God at work in your story? Because I think we can ask that question in a time of difficulty. We can ask the question, where is God? But we can ask it in two very, very different ways. We can ask it with the assumption that somehow God has failed us and God is absent. Or we can ask the question with the assumption that God is good and God is loving. We're truly asking, what is it where is he and what is he doing? And I think everything in our hearts desire life to be peaceful, life to be stable, life to be predictable. We desire to see overtly the goodness and the blessing of God. And yet it's interesting that in the times where God's goodness and blessing isn't so obvious, it's sometimes in those times that God is most deeply at work. And as I've listened to a couple of friends from Italy, so Italy's a Western country with many of the same expectations that we have, and yet they're ahead of us in the curve of the impact of the virus. And I've listened to some Christian leaders, they're processing what's happening, and I'm hearing them say things like, for so long we've been praying for revival. Maybe this is how God's going to bring it. Or finally, people are realizing that their life isn't in their own hands. And if we as people truly desire to see God's kingdom come, it might take breaking us of our self-sufficiency enough to recognize that we actually have a need of God.
Do you got another plan in there, Esther, somewhere? Could we go with a plan B on that one? We don't have to.
Yeah. Can someone else go through that and then we just realize it? And
I'll read the autobiography when it's over.
Yeah. Esther, I want to ask this too. I'm curious. You're bringing up Europe. You obviously don't have an American accent. That's not Pennsylvania Dutch. I think it's Maine or something like
it's
that.
Maine. Yeah, it's New England.
Yeah, it's New England. But when Dr. Farnham was on with us last time, he was talking about the secular worldview and how where he's perceiving this is how the secular worldview leaves us with so little answers to these types of problems. And it's creating sort of it's demonstrating a bankruptcy. So we've talked about how it's maybe creating sort of a bankruptcy in how we've constructed some American Christianity, and there's no surprise to anyone that secularism is quite prevalent in Western Europe. Have you talked to anyone in that regard as far as these people talking about revival in Italy? Are these challenging people's secular worldviews? Is it that type of thing that we're seeing?
I think it's too early to tell what ultimately is going to be the outcome of it, but I think hard times for all of us push us to a place of asking more questions and asking deeper questions, asking more spiritual questions than we typically ask when our lives are comfortable. And ultimately, God can work in the midst of our questions.
Well, here's a question I have, and as I've thought through this as an American, a monolingual American, that we, Christians, and say Mark mentioned the Puritans, the idea that it's the Christians who sought to make life better for the poor, for the indigent. That was a very Christian ambition. In fact, it succeeded in a lot of ways to make life comfortable here, which really then drove the secular belief that you could, in fact, make this the kingdom on earth. And now the church has bought into that, sort of the fruit of its own labor, and now is having a tough time remembering why we started this in the first place. We didn't start this to make this our kingdom. We did this to show the love of God. But in a sense, we've forgotten that. Is that a fair or accurate, do you think, description of what's happened to us in the West?
Yeah, I think as we look at scripture, we recognize that God's heart is for shalom. His heart is for wholeness in every area of life. His design was a good design, and that sin has ravaged every part of his design, probably far more than we recognize most days. And that ultimately God's heart is to redeem and to restore all that has been lost. And we talk about the fact that the kingdom is both already and not yet. There's that sense of which God, I think there's a role for the church in sharing and extending a piece of shalom, while also recognizing that ultimately the fullness of shalom is only going to be realized when God himself comes back and finishes the work that he's started. And Daniel, in an earlier podcast, you talked about the two hopes, and that we have to have a hope as believers that we can make a difference in our world. But if we're tempted to view that hope as a substitute for the ultimate hope, that God's going to actually make a final difference in the world, that I think that's where the danger comes. Somehow we've got to be able to hold those two things in tension.
What I would like to ask, follow up on that, Esther, is when we talked about this sort of already not yet, in some of the previous podcasts, we talked about how a lot of Western Christians, because of advances we've made, because of some of the things that we've done, we can sort of focus on the already and almost think that many of the not yet things can be avoided. I mean, I think you can always hear Dan and I saying that, right? Can we avoid some of this? And is there a sense where if we have societies that don't have the resources actually to knock out some of this stuff, where there's a greater strength in their hope for the not yet?
Yeah.
Is that?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I talk with American Christians, especially American Christian young people sometimes, and there's a lot of ambivalence about heaven. It's like, well,
Yeah.
why would I actually want to go to heaven? I actually kind of like life here. And I think when life here feels pretty good, our felt need and our yearning for the not yet, for the realization fully of God's kingdom, it's not nearly as acute. And yet when I think about some of my friends who are living in deeply broken places where it's really obvious that the already isn't okay, there's a corresponding desire and yearning for the not yet. And I think that's something we have to learn from our friends in the global south. So I think that became very clear to me on a trip to Congo that I took, probably thinking it was maybe 12 years ago now. So at the time I flew into northeastern Congo on an MEF flight. Northeastern Congo continues to be a very broken part of the world. There's a lot of militia activity. It's one of the church leaders there essentially said every system's broken. Our justice system's broken, our educational system's broken, our government is broken. Nothing is working in our country. And I mean, that was very evident in the few days that I was there. I've never been in a part of the world that was that broken before or since. And one of the evenings I was there, I had dinner with another pilot who had just come back that day from flying a mission to a remote area of the country that had just been attacked by rebels. He was working with Samaritan's Purse, and as we were sitting at dinner, he just shared a little of the horror of sin and its effects that he had seen that day, and it really was horrific. But the piece that stuck to me at the end of that conversation was he just shook his head and he says, there's not a day goes by that I don't beg God to come back and fix this mess. And that statement has stuck with me because it challenged me. Like, how often am I begging God to fix this mess? And I think some of that is I just don't always notice the mess because I'm insulated from it.
But I'm sorry, Mark, I'm going to cut you off.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, you said sin, and I think maybe that's what easily gets lost in all of this, that we can say, well, this is a medical problem. It's a viral issue. And so that's not really a sin issue. That's something, and I think Mark has rightly criticized this concept of let's declare a war on coronavirus as if it's somehow just a militant enemy. But the reminder here that we're talking about a sin and is what's happening in the Western church, just the minimizing not only of heaven, but a minimizing of sin. Like that's something that can also be conquered. Its effects can be minimized through a proper use of medication and governmental policy. I mean, do we not have a real true understanding of sin then? And we just masked it with technology and comfort in that?
I'm not sure that I comprehend God's original plan for our world. I mean, I feel like I have little glimpses of what God intended, but all of us ultimately live in a world that has been broken almost beyond recognition. And sometimes we view sin purely in its spiritual sense, where we recognize that sin has separated me from a relationship with God, and that in his death, burial, and resurrection, Jesus made it possible to restore that broken relationship. And yet sin has impacted every aspect of our broken world. And I don't think we grasp the beauty of the gospel until we recognize the depth of the brokenness. And the good. I had a church leader in Africa at one point ask me, like, what's good news about the gospel for a child whose parents have died of AIDS and who has nothing to eat today?
Yeah.
And again, it was another one of those questions that jarred me. Like, what is good news about the gospel? And I think that's where the already and not yet comes in, because ultimately the good news is that God's going to come back and fix it. But there's also this place where, like, God has tasked us with his people with showing his love in tangible ways, and giving a glimpse of the wholeness that he intended for people, even while realizing we can't actually fix all of the problems in our world.
You know, Dan, since you've given sort of true confession, I'll have to dish some of my confession. That sometimes, and particularly if you're a historian, this is hard because you're so not influenced, but you're at least running up against Marxist ideology. And there's a part of me sometimes it feels like when I emphasize the hope, heaven, the other, the Marxist is there ready to bludgeon me with, there you go. There it is. That's your opioid. There it is.
Right.
And you're just passing out the drugs. And so I have to admit, at times where I feel like, okay, I need to speak more about how Christ can, and the gospel and the church can redeem some of the broken stuff today. And by doing that, though, there's a tendency to underplay the not yet, because you're waiting for, Karl Marx to slap you across the face with that. And so, but I think in maybe you almost have to be in comfortable conditions to even think like that. I go back to some stuff I read from Miroslav Volf, and he's made some critiques about the Western world, and said, he came from the Balkans where during a civil war, and said, you have to live in a nice, comfortable, middle-class, heated home just to think like that in some cases. And I wonder if that's part of what we're running up against in the West, where our people, our brothers and sisters from the majority world, they don't have that luxury, and it's actually made their faith stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with the Marxist piece only because, the idea is, well, as soon as you invoke God, it means you're not interested in actually solving any problems. And Esther, you've mentioned that the tension between wanting to make changes, but knowing those changes aren't sufficient. And I think that for me is a very easy place to slip into. I can equate economic prosperity with God fixing it, rather than using that as a way to point to what God is ultimately going to do, and confusing the outcome of all things in the work of Christ and these temporary measures to sort of fix things now. And I wonder whether, and maybe Esther, you can help us, is this the way we can use something like the coronavirus? I mean, as I've mentioned before, I've got friends with cancer. It hasn't happened often in my life, but it's happening now. And I can't offer anything. I can't offer any solution, but kindness, which is not actually going to fix the situation. But so I have to recalibrate what it means to love the person. To love them doesn't mean to fix it. It means to point them to Christ somehow. So I mean, how do we live in that tension? Do we see what we're doing as not final? Do we have to actually train ourselves to see what we're doing as just temporary? Is it?
You use the word tension, and I think truth is often in the tension between two other truths. And the Lausanne conference has wrestled with that. Is the gospel, is the good news a message that we proclaim, or is it also a reality that we live? And I love the conclusion they've come to, that we actually cannot divide. We can't divide it neatly like that. And they use the picture of like the two wings of a bird, or the two blades of a scissor. Like you can't, if you take it apart, it becomes something else. And I find that a helpful picture. And I mean, looking a little bit back at the origins of the Lausanne movement, that's been a tension that they've had to live with, and it's actually been leaders in the global South that have pushed for that tension. So the first Lausanne Congress took place, I think, in 1970. It was the early 1970s anyway. And it was, I believe, Francis Schaeffer, Billy Graham, John Stott. There were a number of key leaders that convened that first gathering. And the question they were really asking was, like, what will it take for the gospel to reach the ends of the earth? And in that early gathering, it was a group of church leaders from Latin America who really pushed the question of social justice. And they said, what place does social justice have in evangelism? And Billy Graham, and you could go back, and I always a little concerned about misquoting. You can go back and check it online. But the story goes that Billy Graham and some of the Latin American leaders actually clashed fairly significantly at that first gathering over this issue of, is the gospel the spoken message of the good news of the cross, or is the gospel also have some kind of tangible aspect to it? And they left that first gathering really in that place of disagreement. And it wasn't until a little bit later on reflection that the story goes, Billy Graham went back to the Latin American leaders and said, you've helped me understand something that I couldn't see clearly from my Western perspective. And out of that then came the Lausanne understanding of the whole church, meaning North and South, East and West, taking the whole gospel, meaning both the spoken word of evangelism with the lived actions of the gospel, to the whole world. And I think it captures well what happens when the whole church comes together to ask important questions. Sometimes it pushes us to different places in our thinking and our answers than we would get to from our own perspective.
So you're finding some, and I know there's a lot of modern criticism for good reason of America, Western church, Western blindnesses, but you're saying that there's actually some benefit there, or some good to be brought into the dialogue, that the Western church has some good things to contribute, as long as they're willing to listen, obviously, not think they've got all the answers. Yeah. What kind of things do you think the Western church has been able to contribute to some of these discussions?
It really is a balance, because we can go to one of two places. We can either go to the place that says, we have all the answers, we have a corner on truth, let us tell the rest of the world how to do it. Or we can go to a place where we become so humble, we say, well, we've made all the mistakes, we've got nothing to contribute, and we remove our voice from the conversation. And I think it's important, you've said it in the question, but it's important that we both share and we listen, and we do both well. So, I mean, as a European, I look at the American church, and there's huge strengths. There's significant theological study, reflection, teaching that takes place in the American church. There's a spirit of generosity and a desire to make a difference that the American church brings. There's an optimism that's part of the American culture that's often part of the church, of like, sure, we can fix this thing, which that can go a few directions that are either positive or negative, but intrinsically optimism is a good thing for us as believers. We should be optimistic about the future. And I'm sure there's a long list of other things, but I do believe that the American church has something of worth to share with the world.
A question I had too, you said offline, and I love this. I wrote it down. I don't want to lose this. You said that we often bring more of our cultural baggage into our faith than we realize. And I'm curious, I see real hope, and so I'm curious to see what you would say this. What tools, what is it about the church that we have the ability to have sort of those conversations like Billy Graham and that other gentleman, where there's a genuine give and take that probably can't happen at the United Nations, that might not happen at a NATO meeting? What is that about the church that we have that separates us that way?
The church is beautiful. I mean, I have to say that. I'm in the church and ministry leadership department. I really do believe that the church is beautiful. The church at its best is so special. So I'm going to step back from the global piece of that and think about our local church in Allentown. I remember at one stage sitting in a Sunday school class, looking around at the other people in the class and realizing there was a city detective, there were 2 people from the state police, there was an ex-Secret Service agent, and then there were 3 ex-cons. And we were all sitting side by side in the same class studying God's word together. And I remember in that moment asking, like, where else in the world would this group of people possibly be in the same room on equal footing with one another, talking about things that matter? And I think that the church has so much to bring to the conversation, but it's unique in that we're a forum where God has said before him in his eyes we're all equal, and he doesn't have favorites. And I really believe there are things we can do as the church that the world cannot imitate.
And is that a place, I think, I remember I had a phone conversation with my own pastor, a PCA pastor, when this thing first started, and it felt to me like the church wasn't ready for this, which unnerved me, since this is the one thing the church should be ready for. You said in one of your quotes, you provided us just some help, and I love this quote from a Filipino, and I'm not sure who or where. It's our time to shine. And I, seeing this as an opportunity, but I think the Western church, one of our profound weaknesses is that we've taken the gospel and we've individualized it, which is true, right? Each individual is crucially important. So I think that's a proper outcome of gospel thinking, but it's gone too far. And it almost seems to me like we can't see what God is doing as the church, which may not mean I'm the one that's going to get through this alive, right? It may not be my fortune where the grace of God is measured. It may be in the success of the church. And after hearing you say that, and you're right, I often said to students in class, I said, it's going to come a time when you're going to have to decide, am I a Christian or an American? Am I a Christian or French? Am I a Christian? At some point you're going to have to say, my identity is with this group of people called the church. And I think for Americans, it seems to me that's a hard spiritual transition to make, that I'm more interested in what happens to the success of Christ's body than me individually. Is that fair? And have other churches, maybe in the global South, have a better picture of that corporate reality where we can oftentimes struggle with it?
I think a lot of cultures do a better job of understanding life through the lens of community than we in the West do, and I would add Europeans to that. I think we're all on a cultural spectrum. Americans just happen to be really, really far on the individualistic side. But yeah, none of us Westerners are very good at laying down our rights for somebody else.
I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a PCA pastor, does a lot of church planning, and there was a group of us having a Zoom meeting, and he asked this I thought was a really good question, and I think maybe it's a question that we as the American church need to ask ourselves continually, and maybe we'll start to move into some of these conversations. He said, what do you think in this pandemic, he hedged it, in this pandemic, what do you think, based on your observation, churches have done well, and what have churches done poorly? And then that kind of sparked our conversation. But I think that's a really poignant question, because then that opens up the conversation like this. I mean, if we weren't all asking these questions, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But then it also means, maybe like Billy Graham, I need to sit with my brother in the majority world and hear from them so I can get a better understanding of what, and so maybe it is the individualism, maybe it is the, and one of the things I brought out was what I've seen in my church that's been so well since this is the deacons have actually been contacting us once a week, saying, how are you guys doing? Do you need anything? It's usually, my experience in American church has been the deacons are there when you're in a jam, opposed to the deacons being rather proactive and saying, hey, could we keep that going, right? Could we keep that going? What does that look like in the church? So I think there's some really good questions that could be asked.
Yeah, I think that the cliche about crisis is that it's always an opportunity, but it's also it's a truth. I think in any crisis we have an opportunity. I think it remains for us to be seen what we do with that opportunity. So I've heard a number of people, and I think in your earlier podcast you referred to it as well, but how the early Christians in a plague experienced by Rome really rose to the occasion in terms of offering care and becoming known for their selflessness and the love that they shared, and that in that season really shifted perspective on Christians. And we have an opportunity in this season. I don't think we know yet how history will look back and say, well, the church of 2020 did this. As I've talked to a few of my friends around the world, they've expressed concern that perhaps the things that the world is hearing from the church aren't necessarily the messages we wish they were hearing. So it's become apparent, sometimes through no fault of anybody, but one of the ways that the virus has really taken hold in a number of countries is through church gatherings. And as one of my friends in a European country not at all friendly with the gospel said, people already hate us. This isn't helping our reputation.
Wow.
And I kind of cringed when she said that, because I know from conversations with her, it's already been hard for Christians in that part of the world. And I would hate to think that people's memory of the church in this season was we spread the virus. I hope, I'm no prophet, but I hope that there will be ways that we respond to this as opportunity, that will grow the influence of God's kingdom, that will change people's perceptions of the church. My friend in Philippines, who she's chairman of Lausanne's board and eternally optimistic. She's wonderful. But here's what she said about the church in Philippines, and it challenged me. She said, we're in complete lockdown, but the body of Christ is not. The church in Philippines has never been more prayerful, more generous, and more united in proclaiming and demonstrating the gospel. God is giving us new eyes to see opportunities to join him in his work. Our time to shine. And her words caught me out. And I think that phrase, like, God is giving us new eyes to see new opportunities to join him in his work. What a beautiful testimony. And I would love to think that as God's people, we would be remembered for that.
And some of it might be too, it'll be not so much during the pandemic as much as afterwards. Because right now the thing we can do is what we're doing. We're social distance and things like that. We can't be like the early church and just run in and take care of people. But there's a lot of talk right now about what is the post-coronavirus world going to look like, and all the way from are we allowed to go to restaurants, to will all athletic events be played without fans? You know, all sorts of questions like that. So it'd be very interesting for the church to see what the church looks like in a post pandemic world. And like you said, I think you're right. It's going to take new eyes and new ways of looking at things. I like that.
And I wonder too, it just, you know, you say, yeah, I guess it's an awkward phrase to say crisis as an opportunity. I think of Mark Farnham from our conversation on Monday saying, if he hadn't gone through suffering, he wouldn't have learned what he learned. And he says, if I can actually say this, I wouldn't go back. Right. And is there something about, this crisis where we as the church have an opportunity? And I think you said it, Esther, which I think was really a profound statement, that you've lost control of your world. Don't imagine you're going to get it back, because there's going to be something else later. And as the church, are we more, proactive about talking about our ultimate hope? I think Mark said that we've lost a real good discussion of eschatology. Like, that's not the center of our worship anymore. Because we're really always focusing on the now, that we really need to start. And I'm wondering whether the Western church does need its own reformation to start thinking eternally rather than temporally. Do we have to just be more overt about talking about the eternality of our faith and about the hope beyond this life? Have we left that off? Is that something that we can take opportunity to recast, do you think, in this day and age?
I think somehow we've got to be able to do both. You talked earlier about the two hopes. We've got to be able to offer one without letting go of the other. One of my favorite prayers or poems, I'm not quite sure which it was, but it was written and read as part of a funeral service for a bishop in Central America who was gunned down, partly because of the work he had done on behalf of poor people in his country. And if I can maybe just take a moment to read it, I think it's one I've gone back to often. I feel like it captures that tension of ministry and the already and the not yet, and holding on to both of those hopes. He says this: it helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing this. This enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it's a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own.
Beautiful.
Wow.
I love those words, especially that phrase, we cannot do everything, and there's a sense of liberation in realizing this enables us to do something, and to do it very well.
That's really beautiful. And frames, I think, the whole conversation really well. And Esther, and a lot of things you've contributed to our thinking, even in this time. It's about 48 minutes in. I would like to open it to questions, if we could, if anybody's interested in jumping in on that, so we can sort of stay within the hour.
Yeah, we have a handful of people, so feel free to type in your question, or you could turn on your camera and ask your question if you so desire.
And what was the gentleman that wrote that, Esther? Do you have a reference for that poem? Because I know I would like to get back at that myself.
It's cited in Ruth Haley Barton's book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership.
Okay.
But it's Bishop Ken Utener is the one who wrote it, and it was in memory of Oscar Romero. Oscar
Romero, right? Okay.
That's a great point too. I think as we're waiting for some people to comment, I think go back to the conversation Billy Graham had with that gentleman, and how our history and our culture influences us. There really has been in American evangelicalism a bifurcation between social reform and revivalism, or the gospel. And Dan and I have noticed that so much because we've spent so much time studying 19th century Anglo-American social reform, where revivalism was a means. It was not separated out. It was a piece of this part. Now, granted, today we might think they were a little overly optimistic with their postmillennialism, but still that bifurcation. And so there's Billy Graham, a product of that, and needed to hear it from someone from the majority world, and right away, some people might say, "Well, that was in honor of some liberation theology guy. I'm not sure I can handle that." But that's an important thing, that we need to hear these voices, that all truth is God's truth, and so not to have that. We fall into those traps. We're products of our history. So that's really important. That struck me when I heard that. I thought, that makes sense that Billy Graham would take that position in light of his cultural milieu at the time. Yeah.
Yet the danger is equally that we back off from the spoken proclamation of the gospel and the truth that Christ died for our sins, and that each of us desperately needs a restored relationship with Jesus as the center point of what he wants to do in our lives and in the world. So we go back to that tension.
Yeah, I've found, after doing intellectual history for as many years as I've done it, that the way to define human error is rarely that it's rarely wrong. It's usually just too narrow. The mistakes that people make are not wrong. They've just taken one small part and turned it into an explanation for the whole. When if they realized that they were onto something really genius, if they could have just added to it the wide variety of truth that's required, it would have been a balanced view or a wiser view. And I think the American church, similar, they've landed on this gospel piece over the end of the 19th, 20th century, which was right. That had been lacking. I think the fundamentalists got it. They knew what the dangers of evolutionary thought would be.
Or the social gospel.
Or they hammered on the other side, right? But then they thought that was the end all be all, rather than saying, as Esther's saying here, that you need that activity with the spoken gospel itself. Narrowness can be our problem.
It seems like we keep coming back around to this, even though this is only our third podcast, but we're coming back around to this, that in this negotiation, one of the postures we need to take as citizens of the kingdom of God while living in the kingdom of man is that Christianity is often complex. It needs nuance, and there are times when and you said it, Esther, you need to hold things in tension. You need to hold things in this. And like you just said, Dan, it's not simplistic. It's not an oversimplistic response. Oftentimes creates more problems, rather than, I love the way you said it, Esther, kind of just holding these things in tension. So I don't see anyone commenting, so we must have just answered all their questions.
Well done,
did
Esther.
We're good. Well done. Excellent.
I'm very aware that there's a couple of Bible theology profs on the call who teach on this, and I really would value their perspective if they're in a position to comment at the moment.
Okay, she's asking for it.
So Dr. Kim's coming on there.
I see something. Yeah.
Yeah, I just I appreciate the conversation. I really like the things that you guys are mentioning. I just wanted to comment on an observation in relation to Billy Graham. Mark was talking about how he was in his milieu, and he would, of course, emphasize the preaching of the gospel, which, yes, that's true, except he was one of the drivers of the new neo-evangelical movement. Sure. And the neo-evangelical movement, in the first issue of Christianity Today, said, we want to unite conservative theology with liberal social engagement. Yeah. And so the thing that I guess I take from that is we need to hold our own visions of these things pretty lightly, because we can get locked into our own vision, and if somebody else doesn't quite agree with exactly what we think, then we end up being someone who opposes somebody who actually, I think, does agree with us.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And Graham went through his own evolution, right, from segregated crusades in the 40s to making changes. And I think that's one of the things I appreciate. Well, I think fundamentalists get a lot of bad rap, but you know, when faced with it, many that come out of that movement made serious changes to the theology to represent the gospel. And I think Graham is certainly one of them. So, and
even the movement he's part of with Carl F.H. Henry and the uneasy conscience of fundamentalism, which is from the 1940s.
Yeah, that's right.
Which starts that out. But again, contingency is always there when you're in the 60s and 70s and there's social revolution. How you negotiate those conversations, if you're Billy Graham, become very difficult, right? Because even though you're part of this camp from the 1940s, how that language is being used maybe in the 60s and 70s, you have to be so careful how you nuance yourself and respond, which is exactly what we're getting at today, right? And just as a pitch, I think we are having Dr. Kim on as a person we're interviewing in a couple weeks.
Yeah,
So,
and if you're into pitches here, we also have coming up, I believe next week, President Tommy Kiedis, who will be coming on to talk about pastoral leadership in a time of crisis. So we've got a good range, and we're glad for Mark and Esther to start us off so well.
Is there anybody else? Anyone from the? You don't have to just be from the B&T department to ask the question. And also too, Joe, did you have anything else you wanted to add or respond to or ask?
No, I'll wait until the interview you guys do with me.
Okay.
Yeah, don't give it all away now, Doctor.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Do you want to do a teaser? Is there a teaser?
You could do a teaser.
Well, I guess the only teaser I would say is that I will agree with a lot of what you guys have already been talking about. But we would hope that, I guess, right?
Yes.
Right. The unity of the church and all that might require something like that. Yeah. Well, this has been great. Esther, yes. Any closing remarks or thoughts? I mean, I think you've given us so much to think about, and I'm so grateful for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for seeking to include perspectives from the globe. I think we have a lot to learn from our brothers and sisters from around the world.
Amen.
Just appreciate the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Esther.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.